For those of you out there watching virtually, hello. Welcome to the 7th lecture of the Root Cause Lecture Series. We're really happy to be continuing to do these and are thankful for anyone who's viewing in. Today we have with us John Foran, who is the Distinguished Professor of Sociology and Environmental Studies at the University of California in Santa Barbara, where he specializes in systemic alternatives beyond our current capitalist system. His work can be found at the International Institute of Climate Action and Theory, in a link that we can leave at the bottom of this video, and within a collaborative educational resource for climate studies called NXTerra, which will also be left below. John considers the climate crisis to be the quintessential existential issue of the 21st century, spanning the humanities, social sciences, and natural sciences, and also engaging all generations and peoples on the planet. So with that, John, we appreciate your presentation on the Sevenfold Crisis.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Will. And thank you to the whole organization, the Western Massachusetts Eco-Socialist Group. I was born in Holyoke, Mass, which is definitely Western Massachusetts. I went to college in Amherst. I had my whole young life up to 22 was spent in Massachusetts and Connecticut. And now I'm happily installed in California for the last several decades. I guess it's appropriate that this is the 7th talk in your very interesting and distinguished series, because my title is the Sevenfold Crisis. And that's what I want to try and lay out here for the first time, other than in the classes I teach. I'm teaching a course called Activism right now in the Sociology department with 90 students. That's a lot of fun. So they've heard about the Sevenfold Crisis. And I've developed the idea of it in several classes over the past year or so. And what I want to do today is to therefore assess the multiple intersecting crises that we're facing. And the short list goes the pandemic, economic instability and inequality, the democracy deficit, pervasive multi-level cultures of violence, climate chaos, and structures both of racism and patriarchy. And I'm looking forward to the Q&A, and I'll really miss hearing your voices because I want to ask with you what each of these might mean for us and how they relate to each other. And so that we can really do what I'm most interested in, and most of my work is about, whether I'm teaching or writing or trying to be an activist, and that is what might we do to confront this crisis, this plethora of crises about the future and futures that may be in store. So I'll say just a few words about each of them in some more detail to start this conversation, and then I'm going to pivot to my favorite topic, confronting the crisis. As a list, we're talking about, first and foremost, the words that I didn't indicate above. We're talking about the global capitalist economy. The first global crisis, and one that's lasted for now 40 years, still going strong, is the neoliberal capitalist global economy, and which is best seen by its effects, right? The inequality that it drives, both within countries and communities and between countries. And that this inequality has only grown over time, measured any way you want. Second, as eco-socialists, the significance of the growth imperative, the expansion of capital imperative that's built into the system, which Marx, of course, rightly identified for us. And most obviously, the impact of that on now the most pressing of these 7 crises, the climate crisis. And in that respect, there's no question that what is driving the climate crisis is the growth imperative, the consequences of that in terms of resource use, burning of fossil fuels, pollution, and all the rest that follows from it. Because the climate crisis, of course, is itself multifaceted. It's not just about a warming planet. It's about the impact of all of that on land systems, ocean systems, and on people, most importantly. So crisis number one is capitalism, no question. But I don't stop there. In other words, and I don't give necessarily primacy or priority to capitalism. I consider these crises to be so intimately interconnected and exacerbating each other, so much so that I really do mean a kind of a cluster, a sevenfold, imagine, I don't know, a seven-sided sphere where they're each connected to each of the others. I don't really, I'm not, say, Nancy Fraser, who recently wrote in a very good set of pieces in New Left Review about climate, which was nice to see because she and many other academics and intellectuals are moving toward writing about climate and coming from wherever else they started. And of course, that would be the mark of any true intellectual today. Any radical or critical intellectual would be that they would have to much more, some for the first time, many for the first time, center the climate crisis. But she, of course, being a very, very good Marxist, good neo-Marxist, is content to talk about the economic impact of capitalism and then what she refers to as the non-economic impacts of capitalism, which is pretty much the other things on my list. So it's kind of clear that she's got a different approach, which is not, in my view, sophisticated as she is, nuanced enough to serve. Because it leads, politics follows from each of these as well. And the class politics has got to be incredibly enriched in other ways, in new ways, with respect to other dimensions of inequality, for us to have a chance to build the kind of movements that we need to build to confront the climate and the other crises. Anyway, a long footnote there. The second crisis is sometimes referred to as the democracy deficit, and this draws our attention to the political dimension of our present moment. The democracy deficit referred maybe 6-7 years ago to the demonstrable lack of support for any party in any political system on the spectrum, a general disenchantment that all parties were not adequate to the problems that people face. Most of them were tried, including on the left, in great experiments of this century, and are still being tried, and I think they're extremely important. But if you just take the United States, where we have the worst possible democracy, a choice between two parties that are both obviously parties of capital. So if we think of the 2016 election, both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump got about 65 million votes apiece. But the number of people who could have voted and didn't was 90 million people. So there's a democracy deficit. There's no question. Now, that election and Trump's 4 years have also shown us another aspect of the democracy crisis, the political crisis, which is the polarization that occurs and is occurring increasingly with the rise of authoritarian and even fascist populisms. So that now we have, two extremes. I don't think the Democrats are really the other extreme, but they're portrayed as such, and they effectively are all that we have standing in the way of, total Republican hegemony and disaster. So I'm a member of the Green Party, but I don't even have to hold my nose in the primaries because I love Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders was obviously the one exception to the devastating limitations of our two-party system. He was doing something entirely different, and people were excited about that. So that overcame a lot of apathy and got a lot of new people in the game, but then they weren't excited when the general election, put up Biden, and Biden won, by skin of his teeth. Is that an expression? Skin of his hair, by a hair's breadth. And just great good fortune. Of course, we're all celebrating that the two runoffs in Georgia gave the Democrats supposed control of the Senate as well, which hasn't played out so well, thanks to Mr. Manchin and Ms. Sinema. Anyhow, this is true. All these things I'm talking about touch down differently in different countries everywhere, but they are found, based on the histories and places and cultures and political traditions. They're found everywhere in one form or another. This is true of multi-parties in Europe as well. Where the Greens can get representation, and where parties to the left of the Greens have hopes of getting representation. And not only that, where the left in general has come to power in places like Iceland, in Greece, a very sad and tragic experience with Syriza, and in Latin America, the pink tide. So it's interesting that we have a new model of revolution, really, which is to elect left governments, most notably in Bolivia and Ecuador and Venezuela in this new century. Whatever you may think of the limitations of the pink tide and the vicissitudes of the pink tide, which is still very much alive. The democracy deficit. So having covered economics and politics, as a good sociologist, I should talk about culture. That's sort of the triad, the holy trinity of basically intersectional analysis: race, class, gender. Actually, I said culture, so I'm already complicating things. But take Gramsci, for example. I think it could be argued that Gramsci was a person who had this kind of three-dimensional approach: economics, politics, and culture. And that's true of the Western Marxist tradition in general, which is the one that I come out of. I come out of a kind of existential Marxism, which I learned in college by reading Sartre's Marxism. The last, decades of his life, he became a very substantial Marxist thinker. What's it called? The Critique of Dialectical Reason is a good nighttime read if you're trying to get to sleep. But it's brilliant. But the whole approach is simple. In any case, the cultural side. So we could approach the cultural crisis on a global level anyway, any number of ways. The aspect of it that leaps out at me is the pervasive cultures of violence that permeate our societies, from our most intimate relationships in the family and relationships in the household to our communities, the police violence, the other kinds of violence that are increasingly everyday life in the United States, the school shootings, the violent confrontations of one side and another, but all the way up in a kind of fractal process up to the militarism at the national level, led, of course, and all around the world, led by the United States, far out in front in terms of military spending. Our military budget is astronomical. We're not at war, but it's astronomical. It never goes down. And it's more than the next 10 military powers combined. So we're in a league of our own. In fact, in a century which will be known as the century of American decline, and not just decline, whatever it means to no longer be hegemonic or number one, we remain sort of number one only in this sense on the military spending level, which isn't to say that we can win wars with our armies either. So it's a rather vast part of our economy that's more or less a complete waste in terms of the futures that we need. So that's three crises. The fourth one, normally I would say, and this is how I understood it maybe 3 years ago, is the climate crisis. The climate crisis, which is related to all of the others and exacerbates all of the others and is affected by all of the others and is distinct from all of the others because it's the one that puts us on a very tight timeline to confront. And climate science is crystal clear about this, whether you look at a carbon budget for 1.5 or 2 degrees and realize that, a sunrise thinks it's maybe 8 more years, 9 more years, and probably less to get to zero, let alone turn it around and just start reducing it. So we're going to overshoot, 1.5 degrees in this decade and 2 degrees, not too far after that. And it will just keep going until we finally have, significant cuts year upon year, which are not in sight anywhere, which is, again, another obvious demonstration of the failure of capitalism, the inadequacy of capitalism to this crisis. You can't solve this crisis with the very system that brought it upon us. But I'll tell you more about climate later. So after the big three of economy, with global capitalism, politics with the democracy deficit, and culture with the pervasive violence of our societies, we might turn to the problem of structural racism, which was brought to everyone's attention on May 25th, 2020, with the murder of George Floyd. I'll remember that always because that's my birthday. And, that only signals is stand-in for the murder of so many other Black Americans at the hands of police and white supremacists. And behind all of that, of course, the long-standing oppression and exploitation of communities of color in the United States, and also the multiple forms of global and national racisms, including, let us say, anti-immigrant movements and policies throughout the global North. So I think there's no question that we have a structural crisis, a global crisis of structural racism that is clearly in the path of saving ourselves, liberating ourselves, and saving the planet. Marxists kind of do a lot of twists and turns to deal with how racism is important, but not that important. And of course, I'm caricaturing orthodox Marxism here. What's interesting, and there's a point I'll come to systematically or perhaps end on when we get there, is that we've of course seen an upsurge of resistance to racism. What followed the murder of George Floyd, from Black Lives Matter 2, Black Lives Matter 1 in the US, or Standing Rock and many other indigenous-led pipeline, anti-fossil fuel, land back, and other movements, are all responses, and vigorous and new and important responses to the structural racism, colonialism of the last 5 centuries in the Americas. We have also the persistence of patriarchy, again, made visible in the US by the movement to overturn Roe v. Wade that's gathering force right now as we speak. Behind that, the whole culture of the Trump administration was not only overtly racist, but misogynistic on so many levels. And again, this is a global crisis in an uneven struggle where gains are offset by counterforce, and where setbacks in one place may, in other places, make gains. For example, in 2021, abortion was legalized in South Korea, Thailand, and Argentina, while safe access to abortions increased in New Zealand, Ecuador, and Uruguay, and abortion was decriminalized in Mexico by their Supreme Court, a rather stark contrast with our own. Which now is the less developed country, I wonder? That's 5 crises, if we put in brackets the climate crisis, which I've already prefigured. In 2020, a new type of global crisis arose with the coronavirus pandemic, a wake-up moment for pretty much anyone, anywhere in the world. If any crisis is global in scope, this one has been and continues to be. And again, similarly uneven and unequal in its effects as they continue to play out everywhere. And here, to make one connection that is fairly easily, readily made, the link to authoritarian governance is rather glaring. Witness what we might call the bad pandemics that people have suffered, and not just, of course, in Trump's US, but Bolsonaro's Brazil, Modi's India, Putin's Russia, and not to be forgotten, the UK's Boris Johnson. So this is a wake-up moment that's going to be with us for a while, to say the least, and play out in interaction with all the other crises. And that's where I usually say, the climate crisis, ta-da, we arrive at the climate crisis with this short timeline and this, trending in every wrong direction you can look at, except the empty pledges of the Paris Agreement and the green capitalists and the corporations. And I recently saw Exxon's renewable energy strategy, phasing out fossil fuels. It was in the paper this past week. So in fact, I'm not going to expand on the climate crisis. I want to applaud the climate scientists who have done their work, for decades now, and tried to raise the alarm on climate. And it's interesting how slowly that has dawned on, and not just on general populations, which by now it has increasingly and increasingly rapidly, but even on, academics who study things like I did for many years, the sociology of development. I thought I could, understand the national trajectories of various places with emphasis on politics, economics, history, sometimes culture, but never climate and the environment, which is just, if I had such a blind spot for so many years that I myself didn't wake up to the climate crisis until sort of serendipitously I was able to attend the big COP15 in Denmark, in Copenhagen in 2009, the one where they were supposed to deliver the treaty that morphed into the Paris Agreement 6 years later. It was only in 2009, by being in Copenhagen, not inside the negotiating halls as it was delegated, but to see the Klima Forum, the inspiring sort of parallel 2-week gathering of global climate activists from all around the world, where for the first time, in a room 20 feet away, I heard Bill McKibben speak, I heard Naomi Klein speak, Mohammed Nasheed, the charismatic president of the Maldives, who played a very important role at that time in, making visible the plight of island nations, came straight from the airport to the Klima Forum, not to his hotel, not to negotiations, and spoke to us. And the disappointment, of course, 2009 as the non-agreement, the nothing agreement that came out of that, when expectations were very high, all global leaders were present, the world was watching, was a blow not just to the legitimacy of the UNFCCC COP negotiations, but to the climate movement as well. And it was a wake-up call. For me, it was, finally waking up to the climate crisis. But for people who had been around for a while, it was the grand moment of, finally being disillusioned with the climate negotiations themselves as any kind of way forward. Kind of like we all, at some point, get disillusioned with the way the Democratic Party sort of always promises and doesn't deliver, or when there is something of substance, blocks it. And Bernie Sanders comes to mind again. And yet Bernie came extremely close to being the nominee. Honestly, how would he have fared in the election is an interesting question, but he could have become president of the United States. And that has to shape our thinking about electoral possibilities in the United States. and the Democratic Socialists of America, good people, are here, and the Sundance movement and the climate movement are here to keep us focused on the possibilities in those arenas. And I believe in that too, especially on the local level, where this talk is heading. I think that we have to confront all of these crises on the local level at the same time as participate in networks that connect us with others. So that's the Sevenfold Crisis. I'm going to keep this to 30 minutes. Some takeaways. These are intersecting, interlocking, mutually exacerbating crises. And it's a good analytic exercise to take an issue from any one of these, seeming silos and begin to trace how the others impact it or how it impacts those, as I did just in passing with the political polarization and the pandemic. But they're everywhere, as is the fundamental root cause. The root cause of the climate crisis is the operation of capitalism. So they're intimately tied together. I mean, Naomi Klein got it exactly right in 2014 with her book, This Changes Everything, which, yeah, and everything is connected to everything else, really. And unless we see that, we don't have an adequate understanding of the present moment. If we're limiting ourselves to just even the most in-depth analysis of global capitalism, we won't get there. We won't get near there. If we have a climate analysis that doesn't acknowledge capitalism or militarism or structural racism and patriarchy, the movement won't get there. So the first task is to hone the art of connecting the dots as a fundamental step to analyzing and understanding our situation. And as I say, it's a great exercise. There's so many ways to do that with so many crises around. We have indeed a wicked crisis in the technical sense. I learned the term wicked crisis as I got more into the climate crisis. A crisis that doesn't have an apparent solution, in which the solutions that are proposed are actually the things that are driving it. It's kind of like a negative, actually a positive feedback loop. The climate science talks about positive feedback loops, which are actually bad things, because they exacerbate the crisis in ways that bring about tipping points, which are not part of any of the models. So all of the models for staying under 1.5 and 2 degrees have no space for all kinds of things that are relevant. It's not just the carbon that we can identify in the other greenhouse gases, and it's still unburned. Methane, by the way, will definitely be, again, if you look at the climate crisis, you begin to learn, to get up to speed, and it's a story. The methane's role in global warming is heating up, as you might say, and we're discovering how serious it is with, say, the permafrost in Siberia or the methane under the Arctic Circle. These indeed are tipping points, not part of the models. So it's bad. It's existential, right? I mean, there's no question that we're gonna, and those who come shortly after us are going to live in a hotter planet, no matter what we do. What we do now is extremely consequential. There's no way around that. But no matter how well we do, the temperature is going to warm, and so we're going to have extreme weather events. We're going to have droughts, fires, floods. It's going to strain agriculture, especially agriculture as usual, business as usual agriculture. But again, that's the other sort of takeaway. All of the solutions are interconnected as well, and they can mutually multiply their effects, exacerbate each other in a positive direction. This wicked crisis, though, is such that in these seven problematic global crises, require us, I think, to come up with a new term to capture and connect them all, to connect all these dots, whether maybe omni-crisis or pluri-crisis or mega or meta-crisis. And I invite you to put your best names for this new situation into the chat and we can take a look. I don't think we've got that term that we want. I see that the last page of my notes didn't print. And what I'm going to do is simply say, this is not the talk that I usually give. I usually start by stipulating we're in a mess of unimaginable dimensions, scope. And I pivot quickly to how do we confront this? And that's what I'm really about. And so I couldn't stop without, at least pointing to, again, not solutions. There's not a solution to the climate crisis. There's only various ways of confronting it more or less effectively without being able to stop it. What are the two, as I understand it at this point in my life? My 30 minutes has passed, so I'm in the right place to tell you that I think there's two big baskets of a whole myriad of ways to confront the crisis. One, of course, is to build climate justice movements. And the network of movements that is the global climate justice movement of movements, it has always been the hope ever since right from the beginning of my, awakening to the climate crisis in Copenhagen in 2009. I was just impressed. I'd studied revolutions for 20 years. I'd studied the new movements for radical social change in our century, from Occupy to the Arab Spring to the Pink Tide. And my eyes, Pink Tide and Occupy hadn't happened in 2009, but my eyes immediately went wide because I intuitively and quickly saw the potential of this movement to become the biggest, broadest, and has to become the deepest as well, global social movement in history. That's still the agenda. I'm not going to tell you how to do this. Those questions are above my pay grade, and above my having answers, only ideas. And if we want to crudely characterize what is the global climate justice movement trying to do, it's trying to stop the bad. It's trying to arrest these crises from getting worse by opposing pipelines, by opposing all kinds of extreme energy schemes and so forth. It will oppose what's coming, which is geoengineering of the climate, the atmosphere, the oceans, and so forth, and opposing nuclear power, which is not a consensus among radicals either, interestingly enough, which is in itself is only another way of saying that this crisis is profoundly existential. That someone who's progressive would consider nuclear power as part of the answer to our energy dilemma. That means the crisis is like, wow. The second big way of confronting the climate crisis, the one that I increasingly have shifted a lot of my attention, work, activism, teaching, writing to, is the co-creation of ideas and practices about systemic alternatives, what we might call. That should be a new field of study. The sociology of the climate crisis is a new field of study, which I have to say my colleagues have failed to grasp, at least in US sociology, let alone the study of systemic alternatives. And yet, that's what we have to do. We have to build the future where these interlocking crises are addressed. And that's why I come back to the local level. And I've been very privileged, really, to live in a community adjacent to UC Santa Barbara where students who make up 80% of the community and other residents have a long history of contestation, environmental movements for peace, movements for local political power. And we have created a kind of DIY, multifaceted movement, organization, adventure called EcoVista, We want to turn the community of Isla Vista, California into something that we could call Eco Vista. And I'll put the link to that. Eco Vista closed now. Eco Vista is part of the network of transition towns in the United States. Much could be said about the transition town movement, and I have some important new information about that, but I think it's time to stop. Let's confront the crises with social movements, global movements for social justice. Climate justice is social justice. And to have the fun adventure of getting involved in this network of communities and practices all over the world to create the systemic alternatives that we need. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, John. That was awesome. You did have, there was one comment, the meta crisis is a good term. So you have one upvote for the term meta crisis. And there are some questions too. The first, I guess, was touched on a couple times. So we'll start there. Is a third-party election feasible in 2024? This is something that's getting a lot of attention now with the Great Resignation and also the rise of labor movements. Once again, I think I read something that this type of labor activity hasn't occurred since the early 30s. And in the context of the Great Resignation and the rise of labor movements, how can you see those things propelling people to vote for maybe a third party? Clearly, they show dissatisfaction with the status quo. Do you have any comments?
That's a great topic. Our system is, as I mentioned, one of the most undemocratic, imperfect versions of the generic term democracy that one can imagine, right? So, both Hillary and others have won the popular vote and not been elected president. That means, we have a Senate where every state gets 2 senators, which is ludicrous. We have a first past the post system where any third party is almost doomed from the beginning. And much as I love the Greens, they're never going to get more than 1% of the national vote. And yet, if we had a multi-party democracy and ranked choice voting or proportional representation, as in Europe, I think US Greens could get 5%. But now progressives have no reason to vote for the Greens if they really, think the election is at stake, sadly. So my hope for 2024 would be, a third party on the right to divide the vote. A third party on the left in 2024 is likely to have negative effects, which doesn't mean don't try to build a third party. So what is it now? The People's Party is something is rising actually in New England is where I'm most aware of folks working on that, but I haven't studied it. And we've seen success, but again, at the local level, whether it's nonpartisan or, which of course it's not really, but at the local level, you can be more radical than the Democrat, even the left of the Democrats, and have a chance to bring something really new and exciting into politics. And I think that trying to get positions on city councils and such entities is a real potential game changer. So that's kind of where I would put emphasis if I was advocating something even that would formally be called a third party. We dream of having an Eco Vista party. That would be something different and fun to do because you could win. Now, what you do with the power is the other classic question, right? The anarchist critique of electoral politics is, I respect John Holloway, changed the world without taking power. Ironically, the name of my book on revolutions is called Taking Power. But the difficulties of the left in power have been enormous, and yet they are crucially important experiments because I do believe in it. What's the antidote to a democracy deficit is real democracy, deep democracy. And we're going to have to fight for that on every level, including in elections, which is sort of what most people associate with democracy.
Definitely. There's another question here, and it's an interesting one. Do you have any comments on the rise in diverse representation in advertising by corporations? You're seeing this kind of everywhere on the airwaves, and it's the same the same corporations that are doing the most, or performing the most oppression, like large banks and even fossil fuel companies, are, I think, solving this push for representation since the murder of George Floyd with advertisements that appear representative. And I think this is just another adaptation of capitalism in action. Do you have any other comments on that?
That's certainly true. We know that the greenwashing and the diversity claims of any large corporation are words on paper that's designed to diffuse critique and change, on the one hand. And yeah, we have the statistics that 80% of all the emissions ever put in the atmosphere can be put down to 100 corporations historically, or X number of countries. The 1%, the political and economic elites everywhere, are the enemy, and they're wily. Yes, just as capitalism as a thing, if it is a thing, has a way of solving its crises. It solved the Great Depression crisis. It's trying to solve the Great Recession of 2008, 2010. So we saw a very, the most interesting decade so far of our lives has been from 2010 to 2020. And that's nothing compared to this decade that we're in right now, which I refer to as the decade of decision. I like the alliteration. So it's all just words. But on the other hand, what it is, it's also a marker of the state of play. Because unless there was Black Lives Matter, there wouldn't be any kind of corporate statement of any kind whatsoever. If we look at the the Paris Agreement, the 2015 agreement, it has the words climate justice in it. It has indigenous rights in it, mostly in the preamble, which is not none of the Paris Agreement is binding, first of all. So you could say that the only reason any of that is there is because people have showed up for years at the COPs, the Congress of Parties, the 196 nation 2-week festival of negotiations that happens every November. Those are markers of wins, but it's a real soul-sucking process to go to the COP. I've been to 5. On the inside too, as a delegate of civil society. And first it's bewildering because it's so complex. But soon enough, you see the main line, which is complete corporate capture of the process, complete, no ability to think outside the box. Everything is public sector, at best private sector. I was in Poland in 2013, COP 18, and they had all these pillows and cushions around because you get tired and drained. It's physically exhausting to go to the COP. And on the logo was of some big energy company. It's blatant and it's pervasive. It's been true of every COP you can look at, and that's always pointed out by the movements. They give fossil of the day awards to the worst country on that particular day in terms of subverting any kind of movement. There's no movement in those negotiations. They're a complete, if anything, it's bad that we have the Paris Agreement because that's chilled out a lot of people. The governments are doing something. It was hailed initially as, something that had a good side as well as an obvious bad side. But I think it would have been better to have no agreement and for those negotiations to collapse, because they can never lead anywhere. The global north will never give up their hold, their power. And the climate negotiations are a crystal clear example of this. It's extremely frustrating to be on the inside fighting for climate justice. And there are wonderful people who do that. But yeah, never again shall I set foot in a COP. I'd like to abolish the COPs.
Yeah, we had one comment earlier on from Robert Pollan. When he presented, he said that the only thing to come out of the COP was that they rescheduled their next meeting for next year or something along those
Look where they have the COPs. It's going to Egypt. It's authoritarian, vicious repression central. And they're going to be able to keep, that government will make it hard for the movement folks to get there, the delegated civil society members. And the UK should not have had this COP under the pandemic we were in, because it was completely irresponsible. They said, oh, we'll get all the negotiators here. We're going to do special things for the vaccines and everything. And they didn't do it. So it was an apartheid kind of COP, people have called it. It was the most unequal and exclusive COP ever. And we got Egypt, and then I don't know where it's going after that, some other awful symbolic nation. I mean, I went to Qatar in 2012. Qatar. It's been in Poland 3 times. It's supposed to rotate among the continents. It's been in Poland 3 times in 10 years. And Poland is the worst fossil fuel villain of all of, supposedly progressive Europe. Anyway.
And another question, in your work studying revolutions, what are the similarities that you see nowadays to what you've studied in the past, maybe in Latin America or elsewhere?
Well, that is my cue to make you guys happy you came by posting in the chat links to 3 free books, one of which is the aforementioned Taking Power. I am pleased to say we got free PDFs of the 2 big books I published, one on the Iranian Revolution and one on revolution in the Third World in the 20th century. They're called Taking Power. And the first one in there is the book that is sort of the first place to go if you want to understand systemic alternatives in a wide scope, and that's called Pluriverse. That's been put together by some fantastic radical scholar activists. Ashish Kotari in India is on the leading edge of thinking about and creating systemic alternatives in my book, and the others are all heroes one way or another. And the book is basically 100 short entries of 3 or 4 pages, each devoted to, some of them to what are clearly reformist solutions, in quotes, but the bulk of which are very radical, and no one could possibly know all of them. I don't care what your sort of state of understanding the world is. There's just too many. And a lot of them are about ideas. We should all, by the way, this is not a favorite thing eco-socialists like to hear. We should be learning about degrowth, because we cannot, degrowth's only limitation for me is not a social movement. The idea is fantastic, and eco-socialists need to wrap their heads around it. And not realize that it's limited or it's a competitor, and create a kind of straw person critique, because we tend to do that. We don't read carefully enough the things that we just dismiss out of hand. And that's partly what I'm talking about in terms of we shoot ourselves in the foot. I think that was in the page I didn't print out by having these really quite petty arguments. It doesn't matter who has the right analysis at this point, and it was obvious for decades that, all these splinter groups on the left, it's like, I don't know. How can it be like one true God if there's four major religions that say they have the answer? Well, you're only creating smaller and smaller groups if you're going to insist on having the right answer before you even talk to anyone. And that's true, in some really important ways today. And it makes sense that it's true because people now have to come from various previously siloed social movement spaces and work together to connect the dots. And I think that's true within the climate movement itself. I'm a member of 350. I'm a member of System Change, Not Climate Change. I've worked for Extinction Rebellion locally, you name it. These are all important. And I think the climate movement is ahead in a lot of ways because increasingly it is intersectional. Increasingly it understands that, as I said, climate justice is social justice. Anyway, I'll stop.
Thanks a lot for sharing those, John. I'll definitely look into them, and we can even put them in the description to this video once it gets posted. There is maybe we have time for one or two more questions, if that's okay.
Great. I'm putting a couple more links there while you formulate those for me.
Awesome. So another question we have here is, many people, especially the working class, have lost faith in the Democratic Party, given the failure of the Biden administration to act on so many crises, especially the climate catastrophe. However, given the difficulty of electing a third-party candidate due to the intentional suppression from both Republicans and Democrats, do you see a meaningful way forward moving from a bottom-up, working people-powered movement rather than something that goes through an electoral cycle?
My answer is always we need both. We need to figure out how to do both. And that's always been my approach to, climate activism. This is all I teach undergraduates about this. And, all I'm trying to do is encourage folks to do whatever they think is within their power to do, whatever aligns with their skill set and their values, however large or small or individual change or organized political movement stuff. We need all hands on deck. The question, however, was about US politics. What was the question?
Oh, no worries. Do you see a meaningful way forward coming from a bottom-up, working people-powered movement rather than something through an electoral cycle?
Yeah, so both. And the critique of an emphasis on local alternatives is, the crisis is global, the crisis is national. We don't have time to solve it on a local level. On the local level, we're hemmed in anyway by capitalism. We can't be radical locally for a systemic alternative. But there is a difference when you start talking about a network of local alternatives. And there are increasingly networks around the world that fly under different names, that socialists need to learn about the transition town movement. They need to learn about the solidarity economy. There's a whole bunch of things that are working at the local level and making changes. And what's important not only is that the power that comes from that, the actual practical experience of power that enables individuals who participate to feel, and all the lessons they learn trying to organize something locally. But the effect of networking that, and you also have to start top down. I was all in for Bernie Sanders. His Green New Deal is the most comprehensive, the most amazingly budgeted. This was in the campaign in August of 2020, putting out his Green New Deal. And went way beyond, it took into account some of the early critiques of the actual Green New Deal resolution. And a lot of the critiques also were kind of knee-jerk and misdirected. And that was true of Bernie too, but he took on, there are things there for indigenous sovereignty. There are things for frontline communities. There are all kinds of things in that. And, you know, Joe Biden was the only candidate of that big Democratic field who did not say he favored the Green New Deal early on in the primary process. And yet, this big budget that he started out with, that was the Green New Deal. That would have been awesome. And they could have got it if Manchin, one person, one really know-nothing person from a small place, in fact, over the wishes, I think, of the constituents, the people of West Virginia who want action, blocked that process, and then Sinema joined in. So the problem was not Biden's program or vision, and I was impressed, unexpectedly impressed by that. And again, that is the impact of the left of the Democratic Party, the squad, Bernie Sanders, all of those folks. Bill McKibben, who participates in the platform making, you know, for whatever you may think of his form of climate activism. Those things were there in Biden, despite the Democratic establishment, and they could have passed again. But again, the Democrats are, let us say, an imperfect vehicle for transforming pretty much anything important. But it really, this doesn't come down to Biden. It comes down to the party itself.
Great. And then maybe one last question, and then we'll conclude. But how, in your undergraduate teachings of systemic alternatives, how receptive are these students, and what do you have to say about what they've done with your class, and where do you think that's headed?
That's a great last question, and I'll find the links for, you know, my sort of vision of how education has to change, how we have to get beyond the business as usual university to move forward in this crisis. I am, you know, still after 30 plus years of teaching, astonished by the enthusiasm, the astuteness, the passion once exposed to certain issues, or that they already bring into the class. They're already activists. I teach a class called The World in 2050. The subtitle is Creating Systemic Alternatives. I have a course on climate justice. I have a course on Earth in Crisis. I have a course on Ecovista now. And what students, the thing that I found, you know, aside from having a kind of radical pedagogy where it's not, you know, dumping information or knowledge into people's heads, but letting people be the teachers and teaching each other, you know, a no-brainer for any progressive teacher, and lots of ways to do that, is getting students out of the classroom to test some of the things they're reading about and to see for themselves, you know, can they do something in their own community? And in all my classes, we make that possible. And then when the class is over, there's an organization to go to, Ecovista itself. One of the big projects of Ecovista now is, I can end on this, which is the community is 80% students. Ecovista is probably even more than that. Students or ex-students who've graduated, young people, and a very diverse population too. Is that we're trying to do a bottom-up process in the community to articulate a just transition or a local Green New Deal using the strategy called house parties taken from Cesar Chavez in the 60s, of convening meetings of small groups of neighbors or friends and going through a kind of facilitated discussion where you elicit the people's ideas about, you know, analysis of what are the problems here? What would you like to see changed? And so we're just about to launch that. COVID is sort of going to make that a virtual process. But in the end, it would be to have a community plan and then to use that plan to start organizing ourselves to do the work. So yeah, system change is possible. There are thousands of alternatives. Yeah, I'm an eternal, incurable optimist and romantic, and that's what makes things work for me. Even though, yeah, I'm pretty realistic about the Sevenfold Crisis. Or, there's going to be a lot of pushback. If we really become a threat here in the United States. We haven't seen anything, but we have to be something to go forward, and I think we will.